I'm Dr. Karl, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. G'day, Dr. Karl, Shirtloads of Science, University of Sydney, and today we're talking insects with Professor Robert Puckett.
Good morning, how are you?
And also the master's degree, Jess Ward-Jones.
Yes, 2 last names.
Jess, you're an environmental scientist. You've been doing citizen science. You looked at the snow gum dieback, and I want to talk about that a little bit further. And you also do science communication. Hooray for you. And then, Robert, you're an associate professor and extension entomologist at the Texas A&M University, so you've come a long way.
Yeah.
At College Station. I've been to College Station. You've been doing all sorts of things, a whole range of papers, including fire ants, which is something to do with Australia, and tawny crazy ants and bed bugs and all sorts of stuff. Let's start off. Now, tell me if I'm wrong. Entomologist, it's got T-O-M, and the T-O-M root, entomologist, as you spell it, relates to tomos, which is Greek for segment. Insects have segments. Is that how we got that word?
Well, I'm not quite sure, Dr. Karl. That's the first time I've heard this. That's very interesting.
I actually don't know.
Okay, so I don't know either. This was told to me by somebody who is not in that field, my son, who is actually a bit of a mathematician type person. So we'll say that maybe that's the case and maybe not, and we don't have time to look it up. We'll start with the big one, fire ants. And the thing that scares the heck out of me is that fire ants can theoretically live in 95% of the Australian landmass. And just a bit of a background, most of the population of Australia lives in the 5 festering sores that we call cities. 40% counts as desert under the less than 200 millimetres of rain a year. Another 40% is too dry to grow stuff on. Tell me what we're doing in Australia about fire ants, how they got here, and are we doing good stuff to stop them taking over?
Yeah, so you're definitely on the path to solving these as long as you keep the pressure on them. Up in Queensland, they've delimited the population extent, and they're working an eradication zone towards the interior of the population, where what they refer to as the containment zone. There's good areas to be hopeful about the success of that program, but it's going to require the attention of your citizenry, especially those that live within the containment area. The big concern is that these ants may slip out associated with agricultural products.
Getting it right on a truck. So how many ants do you need? Do you need the queen?
You need a queen.
Just an individual fire ant that can bite you will not be able to set up a colony, or can they change sex to do that?
No, they're sterile. So the workers in a fire ant colony, there may be several 100,000 in each mature colony, they're sterile. They cannot mate.
So they're a social insect like a bee, where with a bee you've got one fertile female called the queen who, I don't think she should be called the queen if she has to pump out 6 times her own body weight in babies every day.
She needs an heir.
You're right, she certainly does.
And then you got a whole bunch of sterile females.
Correct.
And maybe the occasional male or two just to fertilise the queen, and they're gone.
But there's a twist. So with fire ants, we've got 2 social forms. Familiar with this, Jess? You've got the single queen colonies.
Oh, really?
And then the multiple queen colonies. You can have, dozens of queens in a colony that are mated, that then can lay eggs that become workers, and also reproductively capable reproductive swarmers that will leave the colony to start new colonies elsewhere. And that's the concern, right?
If a single queen gets out into virgin territory, can that single queen do everything that's needed to get the whole colony up again?
She will lay eggs that are uninseminated that become workers. The inseminated eggs that she lays will become males and female alates that will then swarm at a particular time in the season, usually during the warmer time of the year, shortly after a rainfall event. They'll take to the wing, where they mate on the wing. Of course, the males have done their job, they die, and then the female swarmers land and establish a new colony.
So you need at least one male with a female to inseminate her.
That's correct.
With the queen. But
that's correct.
Then they're on their own.
And then they're on their own.
Now, Jess, amazingly, when you were talking about the citizen sciencey thing, iNaturalist.
Yeah, okay. iNaturalist is a free app that you can get on your phone or your tablet. You can actually just use it on a desktop computer as well. And when you're out and about and if you see a bug and you're like, oh, what is that? Don't send it to me, because I always get my family and my friends saying, what is this? I mean, I love that. But you can upload it into this app and an AI will recognize what you've got basically in a few seconds. It uses a huge database of photos it knows, as well as the location data to figure out what you've got. And then some humans will come along, verify that, and then that record goes off to the CSIRO, so the National Science Agency, and then scientists can use that data to find out or a bit more about like distribution and movements of native as well as invasive species.
And how are you involved with iNaturalist?
So I've been running the bug hunt with Invasive Species Council. Basically, we're just trying to let people know about how they can find out a bit more about what Australian bugs we have, because we've got so many amazing ones. They make up about 55% of the species diversity in Australia.
Wow.
Or 95% of animal diversity in Australia, our invertebrates. And it can also provide us another opportunity to look for where invasive species might be spreading, because it's really hard for authorities to be able to cover all the ground.
Well, we're supposed to be talking about insects. Apparently you just love snails to pieces, so get off your chest. Tell us about their brain and all that weird stuff. Yeah.
I think that if you know more about something, then it sort of empowers you can know a bit more. So let me tell you some fun facts about snails. Firstly, they have a donut-shaped brain, and their donut-shaped brain sits around their esophagus, so they swallow through their thoughts. They also have one opening which sits above their head, and that's where they poop out of.
So they eat through that?
They do have a mouth, and inside their mouth they have a thing called a radula, which is like almost like an escalator with like little knives on it, and they just like rub their little face knives on these to swallow, and then they poop out onto their head.
The radula is inside their body?
Yes, so it's sort of like a tongue, but it goes up and down when it sort of scrapes away at leaf tissue that it finds.
Can they shove it outside their
Not
body?
so much, not so much as a fish. Fish have like jaws that can extend, but they are soft-bodied, so they can like move around their radula. Just like a little escalator that rubs up and down with lots of knives, and then they poop out onto their head. Another thing I really love is they have a thing called love darts. So because they're hermaphrodites, they have to decide who's going to be the sperm donor or the male. And to decide how to do that, they line up. All of them have their genital opening on their right side of their body. Sometimes you have a left and they can't breed.
Really?
Because they're left-handed, unfortunately.
Oh my gosh.
When they line up on their right, and then they basically joust, and they fire this love dart, which is up to like a centimetre of calcified tissue, and they stab their mating partner, and then they line up, and then they exchange reproductive tissues.
Now, I heard that the love dart also carried chemicals that were simultaneously, and I could be wrong, a bit of an aphrodisiac and also a bit of a paralysis agent as to slow them from running away.
Yes, that's right.
Although they're pretty slow at running away.
I mean, they're not, slowly slide away.
Right. So, But the radula is inside their mouth.
That's right, yeah.
It doesn't come out.
You can open up their little squishy mouth, and you can see it if you have a microscope.
Because now I might have made a mistake, because I was talking about a story way back I wrote in 1995 by some Israeli scientists that snails use this radula to turn rock into dirt, which is really hard if the radula is inside their mouth. And they looked at snails carving grooves in limestone rocks in the Negev desert. Now, I could be wrong. This is something I wrote back in 1995 in my 10th book. The limestone rocks are spongy with millions of tiny holes, and there were lichen living in the top 7 millimetres, and they thought they were safe, but they weren't. So the snails in 20 minutes could carve out a groove 10 millimetres long, 1 millimetre wide and half a millimetre deep, roughly the size of a pin. They were eating the rock. But how can they eat the rock if the radula's in their mouth? And the figure that really impressed me, although I must have been wrong, was that 6 kilograms of snails on 1 hectare of desert in a year could grind and turn into dirt 900 kilograms of rock. But how can they do that if the radula's inside their mouth?
I'm going to guess they don't have bones, right? They're squishy. So I guess if you're squishy, you can squish anything.
It's like a blob, right?
Yeah, it's like a blob squishing. You could probably squish anything out.
Okay, so we'll leave snails now that you've got pieces, and we'll come back to insects again. So the fire ants, you think we're possibly, Professor Robert, on a good pathway with getting rid of them in Australia, providing they don't break that containment and get out in the outback where nobody's looking at them?
Yes, because your plan is taking on where our original eradication plan failed.
From USA or Texas?
From the USA.
Okay.
Yeah, so they came in the 1930s into the U.S. through the port city of Mobile, Alabama. And they started radiating, of course, along the Gulf Coast states and northward as they expanded their populations. By the time folks understood that they had a problem, we were into the Second World War.
And you start off in the Depression when there wasn't a lot of money.
Right. Well, we were flush with that after the war, and so Congress decided we're going to give this a go and try to eradicate them. And so the first step, obviously, is you delimit the population, figure out where they are, start working from the outer boundaries, and work your way down to the Gulf Coast in our case, right? In your case, it's the eastern side of Australia up in Queensland. And I've been sharing this story as I've moved around your country. There's a really great book, if your listeners want to look into it. It's called The Fire Ant Wars. It's actually a PhD dissertation that's been published. A student at University of Pennsylvania looked into this story, and he sort of provides the chronology of our efforts. And anyway, I read it cover to cover on the flight over. It's amazing how similar
to a typical insect scientist right there.
Yeah.
Oh, this PhD dissertation. Oh, forget
no,
the movie.
It's wonderful.
Reading.
It's written in a wonderful common language, and
wow.
everything's cited. It's fantastic. But I almost came off of my seat several times on the airplane because, I know your program in Australia, and basically I was reading your plan, right? But with a fundamental difference.
Tell me.
After World War II, when we approached trying to eradicate them, this was a new ant for us. We were the first country outside of South America to have problems with fire ants. They don't have this problem in South America in the native range because they're competing.
Really?
Yeah, so Argentine ants and tawny crates, all of our really significant invasive ants are living in that breadbasket down in South America together, And so we were the first to try this. And so folks at that time thought, well, this should be easy. We'll just treat them with a lot of the same chemicals that we use in row crop agriculture to control insect pests, which, at that time looked like contact insecticides. So they use.
So what's a contact insect?
so
something that an insect has to physically touch.
Right, or it has to touch them in some way.
What other sort of insecticides are they? Can they operate through the air?
Insecticidal baits. Well, there are airborne insecticides, but we don't use those very frequently. They started dropping heptachlor across the range of the fire ants. This is an organochlorine contact insecticide. As you might imagine, it killed a lot of fire ants, but not all of them. But it also killed their competitors, the competitive ants in the United States. So the next year, we talked about the reproductive swarmers earlier. When they swarmed from their colonies, they landed sort of in the promised land. There was nobody there to...
There was no bio-competition from other insects.
Correct. We lost that war.
Less competition.
That's right. And we lost that war right then. In the intervening time, we have gotten really sophisticated about how to manage fire ants, and what that looks like in my country is using insecticidal baits. So most folks in the southern United States make use of insecticidal baits. In fact, I'd be willing to guess that of the people that keep insecticides in their homes in the range of the red imported fire ant in the United States, I would suspect most of those only keep fire ant baits or some other ant baits around their homes. So we're very comfortable using insecticidal baits for fire ants as a population. But the interesting thing is there's no appetite for continued eradication efforts in the U.S. These ants have expanded to all of the habitat that will support them. And if you want to Google a map of that maybe, but you'll see that is like from western Texas, contiguous range extends north into like Oklahoma along that latitude, all the way across to the eastern seaboard states and up to Maryland. They did jump to California, though. They sure did. And so there's a significant problem in California. So if you're in the northern climate, they have no interest in supporting a fire ant eradication program because they will never impact them unless we get a lot hotter and they get to extend their range farther north.
But that's so short-sighted because in a community, everybody looks after everybody.
Well, that's right. But I think, you couple that with the idea that we know how to clear them from our yards and our schoolyards and athletic fields. We can do this. So we've sort of fallen back to the approach that the property owner solves their own fire ants on their own property. We clear them from our yards. This is as common as, pruning the shrubs a couple of times a year. Oh, yeah.
And what's the effect of a fire ant if and when it bites a human?
Well, it depends. So I'm one of the very fortunate ones. I've been stung while in your country. Actually, you can see this little red dot there.
Oh,
that's about as bad as it gets for me.
Let me just feel
almost nothing.
grazed.
Oh, that hurt worse than the fire.
Okay.
No, they're very painful. You usually are not stung by a single ant. Somebody brushes up against a colony and all of a sudden they've got, 20 or 40 of these ant workers crawling up their leg or their arm or whatever, and they sting. So you usually get several stings at once in unison.
Can people die from
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
I'm imagining a small child would be more at risk with their lower body mass.
I don't know. It's the issue is this. Some folks are systemically reactive to fire ant stings, so you go into anaphylaxis. I think it's a small number of folks, but still, we lose people, and each one is a tragedy. We lost a woman in Georgia in 2023. That was the most recent example that I could find just snooping around on the web before I came. And she actually brushed up against a new colony. So this was an incipient colony in the soil that hadn't yet made a visible mound on the habitat. She didn't know that they were there. And this is something I've noticed in your country. Folks, reasonably so, are very focused on the colonies that they can see. But the real problem is the new colonies that are newly established that have not yet built the nest architecture that's required to deposit all that soil on top of the soil surface so that you can see them, that they're conspicuous in the environment.
So just as a PSA or public service announcement, what would a colony look like as it started from nothing and gradually built up? Would it be like a foot or 30 centimetres across or a metre or a yard across? And how high would it be? As high as like your closed fist or the diameter of a head? And how long does it take to work through into that?
Yeah, so in our system, the vast majority of our colonies are multiple queen colonies. their mound architecture is smaller actually than the single queen colonies. So we have bunches of, sort of volleyball-sized mounds sticking up everywhere, earthen mounds.
Volleyball? Or
a hemisphere of a volleyball. Yeah.
But is the volleyball different from basketball? I don't know my sports.
Quite different. That's more like Argentine ants or something like that.
What's a volleyball? Is it like
a dodgeball?
30 centimeters or so in diameter.
30 centimeters or a foot. So is it like a raised half circle?
Correct. It's a raised half circle.
You're kidding. Mm-hmm. It's like you get this 30 centimeter ball and you cut it in half and you plonk it on the ground.
And those are the small mounds. So a man here in your country sent me a photograph of what I predict is a single queen colony that was probably, I don't know, maybe a meter long.
And how high?
Yeah, half a meter high,
really?
I suppose, yeah.
So that's what they look like. And how long does it take to go from flat ground to the finished thing? Like, is it a day or a week or a month or a year?
It's months. It's a season. And that's the issue, because for a significant period of time after a queen founds a colony, you will not see a mound above the earth, for months.
They're burrowing away doing this stuff underground.
So we got a call while we were out looking at a paddock, right? A fenced off area of land. We typically call them pastures. And
same thing, yeah.
Anyway, we were looking at these colonies, and the land management folks that were out with us got a call from a concerned citizen that had identified 2 mounds in her yard. So we went over with them and took a look, and they baited them with an insecticidal bait. And we thought, well, we'll just walk the yard and see what we find. We found 7 young colonies that she was completely unaware of.
And how big were they? They were just
little tufts of soil that you could barely make out with your eye. So in our system, this is why we broadcast fire ant baits into the environment, because we want to destroy those incipient colonies before they become problematic. And by that, I mean before they have reproductive swarmers that are then going to go out and seed the environment in the near vicinity. And that's your issue in Australia. At present time in the United States, they've expanded to where we expect them to expand. But here, 90+% of your country looks like would support fire ant populations.
So if they got a lift on a truck, they can...
Yeah. They've already been discovered in Perth, but I think that was actually, they came in by sea, not across land.
The thing about insects, I've heard, is E.O. Wilson your god of insectology?
He was until his recent passing.
Yeah, so I think he was the one who said if all the humans vanished, life would go on Earth, but if all the insects vanished, life would have to just change so radically, because they're absolutely essential. They're cycling, they're manufacturing, they're absolutely there. Is that a reasonable comment to make?
I think that's very reasonable. And in fact, I think every system, and Jess probably weigh in this too, but I think every system on your continent, the insect community, endemic insect community, is different from mine, right? But now you have a global invader that's going to impact that community of insects. So, it's hard to predict what sort of changes that will make in your environment here in Australia. The literature is replete with examples of species of invertebrates, not just insects, and vertebrate species that have been impacted by red imported fire ants in the areas that they've invaded.
Jess Ward-Jones, plural,
yes.
Sort of Welshish background.
It is, yes.
Okay.
Mostly Welsh.
So you've been doing some stuff on snow gum dieback. Apparently there's different species of snow gum and their relationship to insects.
Okay. So a few years ago, mostly ski resorts noticed that a lot of their snow gums were declining and dying, and they all had this similar symptom of an insect that was ring barking from the top down. They were ring barking their xylem and their phloem, so their vascular tissue where they transport sugars and water.
So just for people who don't know ring barking, so if you want to kill a tree and haven't got a lot of time, you just remove a section of bark in a complete circle, maybe a centimetre or 2 centimetres.
Even less sometimes. It's just a few millimetres.
Just a few millimetres. You just remove a small circumference, and then that stops the flowing of juices up and down in that essential external layer. That's what ring barking means.
Yeah, most of a tree actually on the inside is dead wood. That's like the hard stuff that's holding the tree up.
Most of the tree is dead?
Most of the tree in the inside, the lignin, is like structural tissue.
It's structural, but it's not metabolically active anymore.
Correct.
Wow.
And then the very outside of the tree is the xylem. So the xylem takes the water from the roots up to the canopy, and that's where they do the photosynthesizing.
The H2O gets broken into hydrogen and oxygen, and the hydrogen kisses the carbon dioxide to make carbohydrate, and the oxygen gets put out for us to breathe.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then that sugars come down in the phloem, so that's the very outside layer, and that comes down into the rest of the tree where it goes into the roots and so on. It's really just the very outer few millimetres on a snow gum that is that vascular tissue, and it's delicious for a bug to eat.
So we're talking snow gums, and can you just sort of paint a picture? How big is a snow gum?
Snow gums are like a collection of different species.
Oh, really?
Porciflora is a snow gum that can grow basically all around Southeast Australia. It's even down to the coast, and they're quite plastic so that they can grow in lots of places and they can get really tall.
Even down to sea level?
Even down to sea level,
right.
up to 30 metres, and they could get to a metre across even. Take a long time to get there, but they can be.
Yep.
And then above 1,400 metres in the Australian Alps, so there's a part in the Brindabellas and ACT, through Kosciuszko in New South Wales, and into the Alps in Victoria, and a very small part of Tasmania where they call that the subalpine zone, so above 1,400 metres.
Yep.
And up to the tree line, which is around maybe 1,800 metres, there's only one species of tree, a collection of subspecies of tree that can grow there, and they're called the snow gums. And there's a few different subspecies, but they all roughly behave the same. And
okay, so now we've got a bit of a botany and geography background. Yep. Now comes a bit where they live with insects, which once again are absolutely fundamental to life.
All these trees have evolved in a place where it's always cold and it's always wet, and they're experiencing some heating and drying conditions, which stresses them out. It doesn't necessarily kill them, but it makes them a bit stressed. And then if you come back and if you think about a forest system, it's normal for there to be maybe one or two trees in a system that would be stressed. Invertebrates often are responsible for breaking down those trees and nutrient cycling and putting that nutrients down into the soil.
So invertebrates are creatures without a spine.
Yes.
Enter the insects.
Yes.
Okay.
And one of those bugs in a system like this is called a longhorn beetle, a cerambicid. And it's about maybe 4 centimetres long. It's brown. It's got these really long, they call them horns, but they're an antenna, the length of their body.
The excitement on your face, you love this creature to
I
pieces.
do. I love all of them. And they use this antenna to smell, basically. They're like chemical receptors. And they can smell when a tree is stressed, and they say, that's my food. I'm going to go find it. So what's happening is you're getting this synchronizing factor, which is making all these trees stressed at once, and they're just responding. So they are a native species, and then they're good to have in the system because you need them to break down trees and nutrient cycle. But what they're doing is they're just responding to the synchronization, and they're feeding on all these trees. And they're feeding on the trees. Yeah, so they ring bark those trees by feeding on the xylem and the phloem, so
but
the sugar in the water.
Normally they only do a few.
It would be normal in a system which is heterogeneous, so it's patchy. In a healthy system, you've got lots of different things going on to go find that tree and to feed on it and then go to the next one, and then you end up with like a really patchy system. But
the healthy trees, they don't touch.
If they're too wet, they just sort of drown in it. But if they're dry, then they can eat it and it's delicious. We're calling it snow gum dieback because it's happening in basically all the places we've looked. So in the ACT, all through Kosciuszko above 1,400 metres and down into the Alps.
So dieback, what does that word mean?
Sort of umbrella term for the decline and the eventual death of a forest. It could apply to lots of different mechanisms. There are other occurrences of dieback, for example, in the Monero that are attributed to other factors, which are debated, but it is a different beetle species, a weevil. So in this case, it's just snow gums. What we're attributing it to is a compounding factor of stress trees as well as a native beetle. So there's a few different things that the research group at ANU and a few other places are trying to do. One of them is provenancing trials. So you have your species and then you have your subspecies and then you have provenances, which are sort of like one that grows over here in Victoria and one that grows in New South Wales and maybe one in the ACT, and they have genetic diversity, and it's healthy to have genetic diversity because they all have different trees. And the trees might have different traits that make them slightly more resilient. So they're trying to investigate what traits these trees might have that might make them more resilient, in particular to climate, that might make them more resilient to being ring-barked by these trees, with the idea that maybe we could potentially replant places that might need it.
So are we seeing a bit of a dieback in the snow gums now?
Right now, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Maybe the past 10 years. It's really a work in progress, but dendrochronology is being used, so that's the study of tree rings, to figure out how the growth patterns have changed when it started to kick in, this dieback occurrence. But we are seeing it basically every subalpine zone where these snow gum trees are growing, I've seen it.
Would you be seeing, instead of, say, a few percent, maybe 5 or 10% of the trees die?
Oh, a lot more. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I couldn't give you an exact percentage, but the occurrence in lots of places is it could be 70% or more. Snow gums, their regeneration strategy is from a lignotuber, which is like the big potato in the ground that stores energy. So they come back, they try to resprout, but they're usually coppice, so they make like a really thick structure. And we have observed that the beetles try to go for bigger trees, maybe because there's more resources. They don't necessarily target the small trees, but hopefully those trees get bigger. So, and the other thing we're trying to do is see if we can figure out ways to manage the bug itself. The ceramicid expert is a guy called Larry Hanks. He's from Chicago, and he also Hanks, who you might be able to guess who's he's related to.
No.
He's Tom Hanks' brother.
Wow.
Yeah, and he's the global expert on these bugs. So hopefully we can get him in and have a look.
Wow. Now, look, we've covered a lot of territory.
Mm-hmm.
With you, Professor Robert Puckett, how can people follow you and your fine work? And if they want to become your student, for example, or just follow you on social media, how can they find you?
We're a forward-facing university in the United States. You can just Google Department of Entomology, Texas A&M University, and there you'll find our faculty page. And
you're at College Station.
College Station, Texas. That's right. I've noticed a lot of Australians start their sentences with when they'll say, "Look, Dr. Carl." We use L, but we say "listen" before we start a sentence oftentimes.
Jess Ward-Jones, how do we find you and your fine work? How do we follow you?
For sure. On Instagram, I'm Jess_likes_bugs.
Jess
_likes_bugs.
LIKES?
Yes.
And that's lowercase? It doesn't matter?
All lowercase, yeah. Or if you're interested in the snow gum dieback in particular, if you just Google snow gum dieback, the website, the first one that come up will be our research group.
Oh, wow. Look, thank you very much for just introducing us to the wonderful world of insects.
Thank you for having us.
Shirtloads of Science is washed, spun and aired by the University of Sydney.